Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. This is a very special episode for a variety of reasons. But first of all, I want to welcome my awesome guest, best-selling author, and one of my dearest friends, Barry Eisler. Hi, Barry. How are you doing?
Hey, Wim. So good to see you.
So just so everybody knows, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you're listening to this, Barry and I have been friends for a very long time. We have a very similar sense of humor that might possibly just a little bit shine through in the conversation. Don't hold it against us. It's just, I think we're born that way. Maybe that's it.
I think so. And it may shine through, especially because I just finished my coffee, California time, and Wim is getting started on the 16-year-old Highland Park, Belgian time.
Yes, so I have the Highland Park here with me. I hope you guys can see it if you're watching it on YouTube. I'm going to save this for the bonus episode on Patreon so that I'm going to get a little bit tipsy then and answering the questions of my patrons. I got several questions from Barry from them. And I'll try to be sober for the main episode that we're doing now, hopefully, because if we, people might not expect that from us, but we do sometimes rant every now and then. When we're talking about stuff, we end up ranting about, oh my God, I can't believe it.
It's happened.
It every now and then. So I'll see if I can refrain from actually getting drunk right now. Anyway, so what is the setup for the show for this episode today? It's for years on my blog, in my writing, in my videos, I've talked about how people have this very unrealistic expectations and this unrealistic view of violence, what leads up to it, how it actually happens, and so on. Now, I've talked about that tremendously. Now, the thing is that from Barry's perspective also, as a writer, obviously, that there are reasons why there are fight scenes, why there's violence in books, in videos, in TV shows, and so on. So I wanted to do this episode where we talk about, okay, what are some misconceptions about violence that we see on the screen and reading books, but at the same time also talk a little bit about, well, why are they in there? Why do movies do it that way, and so on? And then I'm obviously going to defer to Barry's expertise on that front. Right.
Well, you have some of your own. I was telling Laura about this beforehand, and I said, I'm going to be opining about violence in fiction for the most part. Wim will be handling the real world stuff, although don't be modest because you have written fiction yourself. And so you have some of your own notions about how to do violence in fiction and what it's accomplishing in fiction and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'll link to that in the show notes. Obviously, everybody, I'll link to everything that I'm talking about in the show notes.
I heard there's an awesome short story called Hong Kong Brawl. Is that a martial arts and violence in it?
True. So
right, Hong Kong Brawl. That was the name, Hong Kong Brawl. If anyone wanted to look it up,
I'll link to that one as well. There's a whole story there for folks listening. So some thoughts in general. I'm going to go over my list. Let's maybe look at some scenes from movies or whatever that I think most people will know, or a lot of people will know. And if I can find them on YouTube, I'll share a link so you can watch them if you haven't before. But the first one is the Equalizer movie, the first one with Denzel Washington. Yeah. There's this really great fight that happens. I think it's pretty much the first real fight scene where he's confronting this Russian gang.
Does he look at his watch? Is that what
Yes. Yeah, he kind of does. That's kind of a gimmick that they use, but that's the first time I think you see it. And he's trying to help this girl who's a working girl for that outfit. He tries to basically buy her freedom, more or less.
Right.
Which is a tricky proposition to do with a Russian mobster gang. But there's this whole thing beforehand, and they end up just saying, like, they take his money and then tell him to buzz off. No deal. And then he looks like he's leaving, and then he basically says, okay, closing the door, locking it, and I'm going at the guy. There's this whole fight scene that happens. A lot of people call it very realistic. For me, it's a mixture of some realistic stuff and a lot of it that is nonsense. For instance, the biggest thing is he cuts a guy with a knife. He stabs a guy, he cuts the guy's knife's throat, and the guy just freezes and just kind of like then that's it. Yeah. This is not typically what happens. It's difficult to say, like, this is what happens, because then people think, well, okay, Wim just said this is what happens, and then obviously somebody's going to find exceptions or differences. Sure. So that's not the issue. The thing is that when you get cut with a knife, depending on where the cut is and how and so on, you don't necessarily feel it. You might not even feel it until the blood starts gushing. And I can show you a large number of videos where exactly that happens.
I've watched them because you post them on your Patreon page, and yeah, people don't realize that they walk away, they stand there, they start talking to someone, and then
So from your perspective as a writer, and we have to mention that you do have some experience, with writing for TV shows and so on. So why would they do it that way? Why do you think they would just show the guy just freezing and then just dropping or whatever?
So can I give just a little bit of context before I answer the more specific question? Because I think there's a really interesting question here about why is there so much violence in television, movies, novels? I mean, there must be something about violence that makes it compelling. I don't want to, even entertaining isn't the right word. I think compelling is probably the best word. People pass a car accident on the street. Conrad called it the fascination of the abomination. It's hard. You want to look, what was that? Or if you see a fight in a parking lot or something, people tend to look. In fact, you give people really good advice. Like, you don't want to be there. Violence is unpredictable. It's chaotic. It spreads. You see the violence, you should orient on it and then realize you'd prefer to be somewhere else. But still, you have to give that advice because of the natural human tendency to gawk. So there is something compelling about violence. I could give some theories about this. A guy named Dave Grossman, who I know not everybody who's listening might know. Dave Grossman wrote a terrific book called On Killing: The Psychological Costs of Learning to Kill in War and Society. And then there was a follow-on called On Combat, which Grossman did with Lauren Christensen on similar topics. And Grossman talks about violence as the universal human phobia. Like, some people are scared of snakes, and some people are scared of heights, and some are scared of open spaces. Almost all humans are afraid or phobic of violence. Something about it that produces that fascination with the abomination response. So I think that, and we could talk about that itself all day, but with that as general background, I think that explains why you see a fair amount of violence in stories. And it has a use, aside from it just being inherently compelling. And I wanted to mention this because I know that we'll have some writers listening today, and this is, I think, useful. Why are you using violence in your story? Is it compelling? Is it entertaining? Sure, then those are valid reasons. But there's something more fundamental having to do with character, and character is the most fundamental thing in any story. And it's this: all stories will reveal character as they progress. And in life, we know, like, how do you get to know someone in life? Time and circumstances. So you know someone for a day, that's not very long. 10 years, pretty long. You know someone just at work, maybe you don't know them so well. You know them at work, you've met their friends, you've met their family, you've seen them at the dojo, you've seen them at church, you've seen them in all these different environments for a long time. You start to get a better understanding of what that person's all about. But a way you can accelerate that experience is pressure. Character gets revealed under pressure. You can even make a pretty good, not exactly an argument, but an analysis of story by saying that the whole point of the story about the pressures of the plot is to force the character to make a choice under pressure, and thereby reveal the true nature of the character, of the character's character. Violence is a great way to do that. It's an accelerant. It reveals character faster because it forces people to make choice under heavy pressure. So that's a good dramatic reason for the presence of violence in stories. And that's how I try to use violence. Although I also always want it to be entertaining, and I hope it is, and compelling on the page. So sorry, like, I just thought maybe just context before, why the big pick, why is there so much violence in stories to begin with? And then go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I wanted to add to this. I think what you said about, Grossman's statement is that people have this phobia, but at the same time, they have this fascination with death. And as soon as violence happens, death is always on the table. That is always a possible outcome.
Yes.
So just like people watch a car crash, the violence already done. It's over.
Yeah, that's right.
Two people start fighting, everybody starts watching. And nowadays, everybody flips out their cell phone and starts yelling "World Star!" And and There's a really good scene in one of Jim Butcher's Prison Files novels that I'll look up the title because he's got like 16 of them already. So there's the main character, Dresden, and Ramirez, his sidekick in that book. They end up in this big gathering with vampires, and there's a fight. There's a duel between them and two other vampires. And at a certain point, Butcher writes about that. They're kind of getting excited, the crowd watching, all vampires, obviously, because this is a true death. Because if you're immortal, you live for a very long time. When actual death is right there, they're like fascinated and watching. And I think the same thing is true for humans, is that when we see something that, this has a potential, and I think this is obviously for the most part on a subconscious level, but it's very visceral. It's like, I will die one day, and this is happening to somebody else right now, or potentially. So I think that's maybe part of the equation as well.
100% agree. It's the stakes, all the things. It strips away all the everyday concerns, all the everyday consumptions. As you say, it's like a memento mori, and you can't look away. It's the stakes. It's the ultimate. It's probably not a coincidence that so much of what Freud was focusing on was sex and death. Two basic things. We're born, we die. And those are two massive human fascinations as a result, not a coincidence, I don't think. So yeah, totally agree with you about the notion of the stakes. Somebody could die here, and we can't look away. So the equalizer.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's the bigger, like, why is there a scene in there anyway? Well, that's why. And then why is it that I've asked myself this question a lot? All right, here's my off the top of my head answer to your question, and then I want to hear your thoughts. There are aspects of violence that are probably too gruesome that would get in the way of the entertainment. The Equalizer, those two Equalizer movies are really entertaining. They're well directed. The scenes are choreographed in such a way. I mean, I think obviously these things are subjective. And if you showed some of the reality of it, two possibilities. One is it would be too gruesome and people would be turned off. I know Steven Spielberg was up against that with the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, where people were like, oh my God, I almost couldn't watch it. It was so realistic. And he said, actually, the veterans who helped us with that scene, we had to dial it back, because when we did it and it was really realistic, people could not watch it. They couldn't bear it. So we had to make it bearable enough, so like realistic, but not too realistic, so that people could watch it. That's one thing I think that's in the mix. And then the other thing is drama. I mean, if a guy gets stabbed and he doesn't know it, maybe it doesn't feel as dramatic as if he, or suddenly like drops dead or whatever it is that's going on in these scenes. Those would be that would be off the top of my head. I would say on the one hand, it has to be dramatic. On the other hand, it can't be too gruesome, or people won't be able to appreciate the drama.
Nope, makes perfect sense. What I was thinking is that, and again, it's been a while since I saw the movie, and I looked up the scene on YouTube so I could watch it again and get my thoughts. But what I'm thinking is that, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first actual fight scene, and it positions Denzel Washington's character as an absolute professional. He looks at his watch. He's like, he's going to time it, like, 19 seconds, whatever, all that kind of thing, which kind of gives him a little bit maybe of an autistic vibe, which could explain why he doesn't show emotion all that much and so on when he's basically switched on. He seems to be able to fake it well with other people.
Right.
Is it true? Is it not true? Not quite sure. But when he's on the job, so to speak, he becomes a cool, calculated professional.
Yes.
So we get to see that aspect of him, I think, for the first time in that scene. And what better way to show that he's awesome at what he does by taking out 4 or 5 guys?
Yes. So many good things that you just said, which if I can just briefly expand on them. The first is a more general rule of storytelling, which is that you always introduce a character in character. And by the way, I don't usually say always or never, as you know, because always and never might be rare. And it just seems, when you say always or never, it seems to trigger this reflex, especially on the internet, where people desperately search for the 1 in a million exception to say, you're wrong. Whatever. If somebody can come up with an exception, congratulations.
I have a term for that.
Yeah.
Best pedantic, exception-seeking trolls.
Wait,
I made a
does
meme
that come
about
out
that
to an
once.
acronym? Yeah, it's just tiresome. It's like an instinct that I think it's in humans. We're competitive, and the internet makes it worse, where you want to tear down an argument instead of work to strengthen it, to see if you can get it closer to the truth. Whatever. It's just, I mean, you encounter it at least as much as I do, because you read a lot about martial arts where everybody's, the world's greatest living expert, grandmaster, etc. But it's a pretty straightforward principle that you introduce a character in character. And if you go back to any book you love or movie or television show, you're going to see it. I mean, like off the top of my head, Breaking Bad, love that show. Some of the best writing in the history of writing. Go watch the pilot. How does Walter White get introduced? He gets introduced as this henpecked, dialed and like repressed chemistry professor, opens in bed at home, and then he's like trying to do the little the thing his wife must have bought for like $49.95 on at 2 a.m. from television, like a little stepping thing for exercise. It looks like the last thing anyone would ever want to do. It looks beyond soul crushingly boring, and he's doing it. And then we see him at school, and his kids don't respect him. And then he's at the car wash because he's trying to make ends meet. He's not his salary as a high school chemistry professor is enough. I could go on. And then there are lots of little examples that Vince Gilligan layers in to demonstrate like this is who the guy is at the beginning, and he's going to become something else, which is also tied into the whole notion of chemistry and chemistry as change, which is explicit in the show and also thematic. But anyway, that's it. And I could give countless examples because this is just the way it works. Any great story you like, watch for it. Character starts a certain way, character will end up a different way. That's just the way it works. So with Denzel Washington in The Equalizer, what is essential to the character, either at the beginning of the story as the beginning point, such that the character is going to change from there, or if the character is not really going to change, it's not that kind of story, it's more like a James Bond story or something like that. What is essential to know about the character at the beginning? And in the case of The Equalizer, you need to know, to your point, Wim, that the character is extremely adept with violence, maybe a little bit on the spectrum. That's the watch thing. It's super professional, but really, who does that? It's like he's straightening out his wallet or something right before he commits all this mayhem. So those things are going on there, I think, mostly having to do with, we're going to introduce this character in character. And then there's one more thing that's going on, another very important writing principle that I want to mention, which is this. The better the writing is, the more things it will accomplish. Writing that accomplishes nothing, that should be cut, whether it's a sentence, a scene, a sequence, whatever. It's not accomplishing anything. Either you got to change it or you should cut it. Writing that accomplishes one thing may be necessary, but it is boring. The classic example is the data dump, the CV, the resume. It's just like, Wim was an awesomely handsome Belgian dude with tremendous experience in martial art, like that. I mean, it's, and if I were writing a character about you, based on you, and introducing the character in character, then I would need to convey these things. But if I just read your resume, people will fall asleep. So it has to do at least two things to be good writing. And in this case, probably think of other things, but the opening of The Equalizer, introduce the character in character, check. Violence, which is what people came to this movie to see, cinematic violence, check. They're getting a twofer there. They don't introduce him in character doing something boring. They introduce him in character doing something exciting. At least two things, I would say, okay, well done.
There's another aspect of the scene that I want to touch upon, and I think it's called blocking in writing. I'm not sure anymore because it's been a while.
Oh, like
about
blocking out a
action, so that you have an action sequence, and you want to somehow. There's a lot of stuff going on, and the reader needs to be able to follow. So you can't just say, "Well, he entered the room, and punches were flying, and this and that." Yeah. But you also don't necessarily want to give a blow by blow by blow by blow for every minute little detail.
Yeah.
So finding that balance between conveying the action and everything else, obviously, like you said, multiple goals have to be achieved.
Yep.
While at the same time making it for the reader or viewer possible to see what's going on. Right. And in this case here, they do very quick cuts edits from one Russian mobster to the other one, and he takes one
Right.
guy out, and then one guy comes back, and so on.
Right.
But it needs to stay focused. It needs to stay like clear. Like, okay, this guy's done. He's out. Now this guy, he stabs that guy. That guy's done.
Right.
And eventually, he gets to the main bad guy in that scene, who
Right.
we actually shot in the beginning of the fight scene. And the point that I want to make is that whole throat cutting thing, it's very clear that, okay, it's very dramatic, obviously. But it's also very clear that, okay, this guy is out.
Yeah.
He's not getting back up again.
Yep.
Contrast that with what I a movie I absolutely loved, Eastern Promises, Viggo Mortensen. Great movie. Okay.
Just watched parts of it again like a couple of weeks ago for no particular reason.
It's a great movie. Okay, the bathhouse fight scene.
Yeah.
Bullshit. Complete another bullshit. It looks realistic. A lot of people think, yeah, this is the most realistic. No, it's not. It ends with the guy, he already planted a knife in his chest. And Viggo is crawling over him. And that guy, all of a sudden, from his back, grabs him by the throat, basically, and pulls the knife out of his own body. Stab him with it. And it's like, okay, as he's doing a sit-up, crunches, he's getting up. I'm like, you just got stabbed in the chest, right? And you are using the grip here that is going to force your chest muscle to actually contract from a position of poor leverage as you're trying to do an abdominal crunch and stab the guy with your other hand. It just made zero sense. It was so poorly done. And he's just lying there, Viggo crawls over him, I've got you. That was, for me, it's not necessarily poor writing, but at the very least, poor execution. And they didn't do that in the Equalizer scene. There's like, this guy's done, this guy's done, this guy's done.
And he's really done.
Yes. And for that effect to make that clear to the audience, obviously they pause for a second as one guy falls down or as he smashes one guy's head in. You're like, okay, you see him, one of the guys, I think he grabs a shot glass, rams it into his eye, smashes his face onto a cabinet or something, and the guy falls. Okay, you can assume as a viewer, like, okay, he's out.
He's done.
And in that regard, it makes sense for the writers of the script or for the cinematographers and the director to end up with that kind of scene. Yeah. But it's not realistic.
Yeah. So I agree. Once again, agree with everything you said. It's dull. We agree too much these days. I feel like we used to disagree more.
I try, dude. I try.
So I agree with all that. And once again, I think it expands into a really important principle of writing. And you could even say an important principle in life, which is what novelist Joe Conrath has described to me many times as be deliberate. And what Joe, I don't want to speak for Joe, but is a friend and I know him pretty well. What he means by that is know why you're doing the thing you're doing. Do it. If you have a reason, then reverse engineer from that reason and do things correctly. So if you think about violence in movies, like think of a movie like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Was the violence in that movie realistic? I'm going to go with no. But is that a criticism? Hell no. They weren't in any way suggesting that this is the reality of Kung Fu and violence. It was a fantasy. And there's nothing wrong with that. It'd be like criticizing Van Gogh's Starry Night for like, well, I never saw a sky that really looked like that. It's not the point. It's not the point of art. The point of art, well, whatever. That's a whole, I could go down that path, but let's hold off on that for a moment. So the first thing you want to ask yourself is like, what are the rules of the universe that I'm working within? And what am I trying to do here? Crouching Tiger is a beautiful movie, and it's like a fantasy of what Kung Fu might look like if, freed of gravity and whatever else. And I loved it. I never felt one moment of like, what? Nobody can run up a wall, like jump from treetop to treetop. They weren't trying to do that. And in The Equalizer, they were going for something, I think, more realistic in some ways, but within the bounds of, look, it's got to look dramatic because you know so much more about this than I do. You've seen so much more violence than I have. I doubt in the history of violence there's ever been a punch up as beautifully choreographed with nobody slipping, nobody missing a punch and getting like, I've seen some pretty cool things. I think a lot of it is because you posted like years ago, there was a guy, I think it was in Turkey, but I could be remembering. He was obviously a
Boxer,
boxer.
yeah.
He was getting chased by a crowd. It was insane. I mean, the guy was like, it went on for a while, and he's really like, he's got great peripheral vision, situational awareness. Somebody gets too close, he's like, boom, boom. I don't know that he was really taking people out. He was dropping them, but then they were getting back up because it was a lot of jabs. But mostly, like, they just could not access this guy. It was nuts. That was probably, in my experience, as probably the most cinematic real world event I've seen. It was so good that it almost, I don't think it was fake, but it almost could have been, because it just looked so good. But in a movie, I think for various dramatic reasons, that it's interesting to consider why you don't want to see something that's just two people slipping and falling down. I mean, you can do it for laughs like Jackie Chan does, and then the purpose there is it's funny as hell. So they're going for the comedic elements. But even the scene in Eastern Promises in the bathhouse, I think part of the reason it felt so realistic, and I don't know that I'm not qualified to opine on the mechanics of it. I mean, if two guys are trying to kill you with knives under any circumstances in an enclosed space, that's a very bad position to be in, especially if you're naked and sweaty, but whatever. But they made it feel realistic because it wasn't like, Vince Vaughn wasn't like, blocking, parrying. Vince Vaughn, Viggo Mortensen.
Yeah.
He wasn't perfect. It wasn't like perfect blocks and that kind of stuff. It was gritty. They were falling down. He was getting cut. It felt like it had that chaotic, not going according to plan, improvisational feeling that is characteristic of most, if not all, but most of the violence I've ever experienced or seen. So anyway, so I think if it gets too messy, then it starts to bleed off the drama, and you got to have drama. I mean, anything we do you dialogue for a second? Let's very quickly. Do you want your dialogue to be realistic? A lot of people would say yes. I'm like, have you ever listened to two people talking? It doesn't translate well for drama. It really doesn't. There are a lot of things you have to do to make the dialogue sound realistic in the book or on the page or on the screen, but it isn't actually the way people talk. The way people talk is often pretty dull. I mean, to have to listen to it day in and day out. Elmore Leonard used to go to court in Detroit, and he picked up, oh my God, I mean, nobody ever wrote dialogue better than Elmore Leonard. But even he was listening for what he wanted to use, condensing it, distilling it, whatever, to make it work on the page. That's something you just have to do. True for dialogue. And why would it not be true for violence too? So the first thing is, what are you trying to do here? Is it supposed to feel realistic? Is it supposed to feel funny? Is it supposed to feel like a beautiful fantasy of art or something like that? Those are all perfectly valid reasons. True too, by the way, for like, why do you want to study martial arts? There are lots of good reasons. Study an ancient Asian system, cardiovascular, self-defense, all valid reasons. Just like Joe Conrad says, be deliberate. Don't think that you're learning how to be a killer ninja when really you're just developing a better cardiovascular, whatever.
Yeah, makes sense. And coming back to Easter Promises, that bathhouse scene, would I totally agree with you when you say, like, okay, it has this gritty feel. It's just all over the place. He gets cut pretty much right away. He stumbles, everybody, they fall, and it's fumbling, and it's not pretty.
Yeah.
But there's some stuff in there then for dramatic purposes, it makes sense. But it's also a missed opportunity. If you want to take out, if I forget who the characters are that attack him, I'm assuming they're mob guys,
Russian mobsters, yeah,
I think so. But they're there to take him out. I wouldn't say it's bad tactical planning that they try to take him out in a bathhouse, because he's going to be naked and presumably unarmed. Okay, I'll grant that. But what do we see in the scene? We see Viggo sitting down with his arms on his knees, and he's leaning down and he's looking at the floor.
Yes.
And the next shot you see is of the assassin coming in, and he stands in front of Viggo with his shoes on, and you see the shot of Viggo looking at his feet. He looks up, and that's what saves him.
Exactly.
Like, that is the dumbest assassin in the history of any assassin that you want to look at. I mean, that is the dumbest move that you could have. If you're going to take somebody out, you take them out with them having the least amount of preparation time to do anything.
Yeah.
And there was a bunch of things like that. Now, I don't know who wrote this. I don't know who directed it. But the point is that it looked to me like they wanted to give him a fighting chance. Like, okay, he needs to survive. He needs to have, what they like to call nowadays plot armor. So he's the plot armor.
Plot armor.
Yeah, he needs to be able to survive that thing. Otherwise, the movie's over. So we need to give him a shot. Like, yeah, but if he sees the guy's shoes, he knows what's going on. And somebody in the writing room had that idea. It's like, yeah, but that makes sense, right? Because everybody's naked and he doesn't have his shoes on. And there's a guy with shoes. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. So he snaps into action and it's like blocks that incoming knife.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes. Now, so that makes sense because you need something to make sense.
Right.
Okay. How about instead of that, which is complete bullshit and nonsense for an assassin to do? How about instead of having Viggo leaning forward like that, having sitting straight up, like maybe somebody who's undercover in the Russian mob, who's fearing for his life, pretty much anywhere he is at any time, that he's not just going to be looking at the floor.
Place.
Have him leaning back and the guy's rushing in immediately.
Yeah.
Okay, he still has a fighting chance because he sees them coming, but they're storming in, so he needs to. You can get the same fight scene going,
totally.
But just like.
But without something that would be untrue to a character like the one he was playing. Yeah. He's undercover with the Russian mob. He's going to be scared. He's going to be very alert, paranoid. Yeah. Totally agree. And my fix, and then I want to talk about like what we're doing here when we're like, I would have done it this way. It's not second guessing. That's not the point, or criticizing. It's a great movie. Yeah, it's fantastic. What I thought is, okay, it's time. He's been in there for 10 minutes, not in a coma, because he would never do that. He's alert. He gets up. It's time to go. He's all sweaty. It's time to go. And as he gets to the exit of the steam room, the door opens and these guys come in and they're dressed and it's on. I mean, instantly he's going to be like, this is all wrong. And he knows what it is. And now they fight. And what's important here, again, as a rule of writing, what you and I are doing right now is we're separating out the objective from the tools you use to achieve it. So you describe the objective as plot armor. Doesn't matter what you call it. It's valid here. It's like, what do we want to have happen in this scene? He is ambushed by two guys with knives. Why is that good? Because it makes sense in the plot and it spins the plot off in the direction I need it to go in. Awesome. Plus it's going to be an awesome scene. Okay. All awesomeness. But he's got to survive. We got to give him a fighting chance against really bad odds. All good. These are all our parameters. These are all our goals. And then someone said, I know how we give him a fighting chance. It's this thing. And what they came up with was not optimal. That's okay. I doubt everything I've ever come up with in a story is optimal either. But what we're doing is we're saying your goals make sense, but don't conflate your goals with the thing you use, the tool, the tactic you use to achieve those goals. Always in your mind as a writer, separate those things. True too, I mentioned a little while ago, exposition, the data dump. So many times if I teach writing, someone will write a boring scene. Boring because it only accomplishes one thing. It'll be the exposition. Wim was a championship martial artist and also a devilishly handsome dude. And I'm like, all true, but it's a little dull. And they're like, but I got to say these things about Wim because it's essential to the character. And if the reader doesn't understand how awesome a martial artist and human being he is, then they won't be able to appreciate the story. And what I always say is that is true. You are right. What you've just described is essential to your story and the story won't work without those things in there. Now separate what you're trying to do, which is convey these aspects of the character that are necessary, that are critical. Separate that from how you convey this stuff. They're two different things. And weirdly, it does take a little bit of practice before you just instinctively separate, almost unconsciously separate the what you're trying to accomplish from the how you're trying to do so. And we both went through that just now with this scene. We're like, hey, we get it. It's going to be a bathhouse. That's cool. That's dramatic. I'm not even saying, oh, put it in a, make it happen in a park or something. No, the bathhouse was genius, but we want to make it consistent. And Vito's got to have a chance, but it's got to be consistent with Viggo, rather. It's got to be consistent with his character and the things his character would do if he's being true to that character. That's all. Separate the what and the how. Reasonable people can differ, by the way. Somebody else might have said, no, you know what I want to do? I want him having coming out of the toilet, or like he just showered, or he's got soap on his body. I'm like, I don't care. Let's have this conversation. But what we're doing is we're coming up with all the different ways, the how that you can achieve something. And some of those are going to be better than others.
And in all fairness to the writers, is that I haven't read the script, so I don't know what they originally wrote, but that doesn't mean that what they wrote is what was actually filmed. Because I mean, you have experience being on sets as well. There could be things that they had this perfectly outlined scene with the tactics making perfect sense, and then they arrive on the set, and then the camera operator says, "No, I can't get the right angle for that."
Yeah.
The bathroom, the way the stalls are oriented, it doesn't work. We need to improvise, and they end up with that.
Exactly. And they've only got the bathhouse that day.
Exactly.
For it, yeah.
Yeah. So this kind of stuff happens constantly on movies, on TV shows. You think that even on like big budget movies that it wouldn't happen, but it does. Yeah. It does that, or the actor has like he just sprained his ankle or whatever, like he can't do that kick anymore. There's always something. Yeah. And that's why when, like you said, when we criticize, not necessarily like, oh, this sucks. It doesn't. It's a great movie. I really loved it. I'm only looking at through the lens of like, okay, it's not realistic. Why? Well, for this and this and this reason. But I'm always complaining to people about people not having accurate information about violence and so on. But it's not just complaining. You also have to explain, well, why isn't it realistic? And that's basically what we're doing here is like, well, there are reasons why. Okay. An assassin wouldn't stand in front of Viggo and show him, hey, look at my shoes, man. I'm dressed, you're not.
and wait. And
wink,
I'm laughing, but I'm really, exactly. Like, wait till Viggo sees the fully dressed man standing in front of him, looks up and has an opportunity to orient and, even if it's only a second, to get ready. Like I'm pretty sure this is hardwired into humans. In violence, when we see an advantage, we press it instantly. We don't want a fair fight. It's just not in us. When it's real violence, I mean, in the boxing ring or whatever, or the octagon, sure. But when survival's on the line, the best thing in the world is when you have an advantage and you press it. Like the philosopher Monty says, it is never the other guy's turn. So
that's Monty's law. I wrote
Monty's law. That's right. It is, and I've ruthlessly stolen it more than once in novels. But whenever I steal something, I always give people credit for it. So it's
I wrote a blog post. I wrote a blog post about that Monty's law.
I remember
giving me credit, and it's true.
You called it Monty's law.
Yeah. It's one of those things that is, if anything, the exception in real violence is a duel. Is two guys squaring off, fighting, and being cautious, and this and that. And you've got the big slugfest, and then one guy comes back, and then the other. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I would say that is more the exception. Yeah. Counting on when you encounter violence that it's going to be like that is really an extremely dangerous strategy.
Like counting on against 4 guys and they attack you one at a time. So
that was the thing also in Eastern Promises. I mean, he's fighting that one guy, the big guy. He gets slashed first by the smaller guy, and Viggo stumbles away, and then the big guy says something to the smaller guy, and then the big guy grabs his knife and it's going to come at him. And Viggo kicks him, the guy goes down. He's on top of the big guy trying to, basically end the fight. Viggo totally forgets about the first guy.
Yeah.
And then the first guy comes at him. And what does he do? He sees his target is choking out or fighting with his partner. He slashes him across the back.
Yeah.
That doesn't accomplish anything.
It's not instinctive.
It's not it. I mean, a guy who is experienced enough, we're assuming, to carry out a hit on somebody, and even if he isn't, I mean that he really thinks it through a little bit. Well, I'm actually going to use a knife. I'm not going to shoot him for whatever reason, but I'm going to use a knife. That you're not just going to slash him all the time. That doesn't end the fight.
Yeah.
I mean, just cut his throat right away. Grab him, yank his head back, and cut it. That would have worked just fine with the knife he had in his hand. No, he slashed him across the back. Because a fight needed to last longer for the movie.
That's right.
It wasn't dramatic enough.
To be bloody, which, in fairness, it's funny. And it's important to keep in mind all the improvisation they might have had to engage in because of real world problems. I don't encounter this in a novel. So what I'm saying is if I do something in the novel and it's not realistic, I can't blame anybody else. I can't say I couldn't fit those words on the page or something like that. It just doesn't work. But in movies and television, yeah, there are a lot of real world problems that sometimes have to be worked around. But in this case, the scene felt gritty. It felt realistic. It was super dramatic. But right, would these are Russian mobsters. Have they done prison time? I would guess. And by the way, this is another thing you want to do with your characters. Try to think of them in 3 dimensions. Try to get some handle on their history. These are just 2 assassins. They're not central to the story, but they can still be realistic. They can still pop on the page or on the screen. These guys probably had done prison time. You get a chance in prison. Are you slashing or are you stabbing? These are improvised weapons, screwdrivers, sharpened toothbrushes, things like that. It's stabbing. I don't want to say I'm the biggest expert on this stuff. I read, what is it? Don Pentecost's book, Put Him Down, Take Him Out. Made sense to me. Made sense. Seen a lot of videos of prison hits, the during and the after. And I think it's also a human instinct. Stabbing is more of a human instinct, I think, than slashing. We just recognize slashing is more biomechanically awkward, easier to stop, and just doesn't do as much damage. I think we know these things. So I would have said these guys being probably they've done time, they're Russian mobsters. They are there to put him down. It's not supposed to be a fight. It's supposed to be an assassination.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can come up within the realm of what I just described with all the ways of satisfying the dramatic needs. By the way, I try to do this in my books. There's a big knife fight in my 4th book, Redemption Games. But I'm always looking for a way. I have to answer the question, why didn't my character, John, in this case, John Rain, why didn't John Rain just run away? Saw the guy had a knife. And the reason was he didn't know it was behind him. The guy was too close. He was afraid if he turned, then the guy would run him down with the knife. And so it was better to face him. And Rain gives a few pointers on what it means to face a determined adversary who has a blade and you're unarmed, which I learned from Mark McYoung, no nonsense self-defense. But the point is, like, I don't ever want someone to read a scene I wrote and say, why didn't Rain just blah, and not have a good answer. I want the knife fight. It's dramatic. That's why we're here. We want to see it. But it has to make sense for me, has to make sense given everything we know about the character, everything we know about the circumstances. I never want someone to say, well, it was a fun knife, but it was contrived. Like, Rain would have just run away because he could have. He was wearing Nikes. What stopped him?
What you mentioned a little bit before was, I think, a really good point is that, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, it's a fantasy movie, so it's going to be fantasy violence. And if we have that on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum, we have Saving Private Ryan, the original cut that they never aired, apparently, that they toned down because veterans were actually just, really suffering from watching it because it was too realistic.
Yeah.
So let's take those two as being opposite ends of that scale. When you write, you write, realistic thrillers. Not everybody does. Some people write, spycraft, and they have, James Bond is fantasy. There's nothing realistic about James Bond.
Right.
He's either dead or a cripple by now.
Yeah.
Everything that he's had. So, but when it comes to TV and movies, it needs to be visual. I think the big difference between writing books, between the written word and what is on the screen, is that you don't get to explain anything in a scene, in an action scene. Yeah. You don't get to go inside the head of the characters, which you can actually do in writing. And the only exception that I can remember that I actually liked was Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. That
they slowed it down and showed where he was visualizing.
Yeah, and it's like, think of this, I'm going to throw the handkerchief, and I'm going to punch there, and I'm kick there, and just discombobulate, hit him in the ears. Yeah. And you can do that as an author in your scene. Doesn't have to be that way, but does that make sense?
Totally makes total sense. And in fact, this very question has come up with, there's been a good, impressive group of people who've been trying to develop the Rain books into a television series. We'll see if anything comes of it. They're great. I have a lot of respect for them, but realistically, the odds are always tremendously against these things. So, I try to keep my hopes realistic. But one of the challenges is, how do we translate the violence as it's portrayed in the books onto the screen. And what's interesting is a lot of times people will read my books and they'll be like, oh my God, they're so cinematic. They'll make great movies or television shows. And that's a nice reaction. That's flattering. And I hope they're not wrong. I hope we'll find out. But what they're responding to is you really feel like you're there. I hope. I mean, if I've done my job well, you feel like you're there in all the different scenes I create, including the scenes, the violent scenes. But what I'm able to do on the page that for me is, it's unusual, at least I'm not saying it's unique, but it's unusual among the books I've read. And I think it's really effective for a lot of reasons, which probably bear talking about for anybody who listening to this, watching this, who's a writer. You're in John Rain's head. If it's a violent scene and it's John Rain, I've almost always written him first person. And so he's like your guide to what's going on. Now, this isn't easy to do because I don't want to slow down the action. I don't want to bleed off the drama and the tension and all that. But he can tell you why he's doing things or what tripped him off. Like he sees something, he sees an environmental anomaly, like a more subtle version of, well, I was in the bathhouse naked where everyone's naked. And suddenly there was a guy in, combat boots and a black leather jacket. And I thought, it's on. But more subtle things that someone as superbly attuned to his environment as Rain is would notice. And then Rain will sometimes say to the reader, like, is this something that, in fact, the scene I was talking about a moment ago, the knife fight in the fourth book, the thing where he's like, he just decides. It's not like the guy doesn't hold up a sign that says, I am your assassin, I'm here to kill you today. It's very subtle. And Rain just makes a decision. And he explains that to the reader. Again, within the context of the drama, I don't want to get in the way of it. But he says, like, would this ever stand up in court, Your Honor? Like, he looked at me funny, Your Honor. I couldn't see his right hand, Your Honor. Like, he had no business being there, Your Honor. I told him, don't come any closer, and he kept coming. Like, would this stand up? Probably not. Do I care? No. I'm John Rain. So I have opportunities to weave in those sorts of firsthand observations, explain to the reader what they mean, and explain to the reader, like, why John Rain firsthand, why I, as John Rain, am I doing these things based on what I've seen and what am I trying to accomplish here? And it makes, if I'm doing my job right, and the drama is not only adversely affected, the drama winds up getting tuned up by the fact that you've got this personal guide to so many elements of violence. But how do you do that on the screen? You have to repurpose, you have to figure out some way of making the screen violence feel like the page violence. Same goal, drama. Tell me about the character. Is he professional? Is he cool under fire? Whatever. Like, same goals, but very different tools. Page tools, screen tools, not the same. So that's something to keep in mind for all these scenes. The tools you have at your disposal as a novelist versus as a screenwriter. And one last thought about this relates to everything you do in writing or on the screen. There's a saying I like, which is arguably a cliche, but there's so much truth in it, which is, don't describe the rain, describe the way the rain feels. That's a really important thing to keep in mind, especially for anybody, say, with a big martial arts background. Like, you're great at martial arts, you got 30 years experience, you're the man, the woman, whatever. You will probably have a natural tendency to go into a lot of detail about the mechanics. It's natural. You know the mechanics super well. And there's nothing wrong with going into the mechanics. It could be a sex scene, could be a violence scene. The mechanics are necessary, but not sufficient. Some degree of mechanics. I got to be able to see what's going on. But you can't let the mechanics get in the way of your real goal, which is to make readers or viewers feel what's happening in that scene. That's what makes a story work. I feel like the character. That's the goal. Same thing with a love scene. If you're just tab A, slot B, then maybe people could be titillated, especially if they're teenagers. But that's not the point. How do the characters feel about each other, about what's happening, about where this might go? That's the purpose. That's the objective. Everything else gets reverse engineered from that and is a tool. That's what you want to keep in mind, however you're approaching whatever kind of scene.
Yeah, makes sense. And just an example that I thought of, I think this is the second or the third Jason Bourne movie, I'm not sure anymore, where it's this journalist that I think it's in London, in this train station, he's trying to, get in contact with him, and everybody else tries to kill that journalist. And there's a bunch of operators who are basically there to capture Jason and the journalist. And again, it's been a while since I saw the movie, but if I'm remembering it well, you see these guys just basically moving around. It's just blatantly obvious who they are.
Yeah.
In real life, they would not. You'd have to be extremely well trained to spot them if they're any good. If they're bad, obviously that's something else. But that doesn't come across on the screen. If they act too realistic, it's just like why did Jason Bourne just punch that guy or kill him? Like, what the fuck's going on?
You mean man, Jason Bourne.
Yeah. And in that regard, it is impossible, I think, to bring across certain things realistically on the screen, whether it's TV or movie, which you can explain in a book. You can, the way, like you said, you give an example. 100%. Well, this is for this and this is the reason. This is all wrong. He shouldn't be here. Or why is he standing like that? Or I can see, you can see the bulge of the weapon printing, on its clothes, and so on. One of the great examples that I have is, and the reason why I like Casino Royale so much, the new one with Daniel Craig, is very early on in the movie, there's that scene where it ends up being the parkour scene. He's got his colleague there, and they're talking and communicating. And he's like, "Stop touching your ear." And I'm like, "Yes, finally," because I mean, in real life, they don't touch their ear when they're communicating. The only reason you really do that on the screen is so that you, as a viewer, know, like, well, he's not talking to ghosts or anything. He's got an earpiece. He's communicating, or he's talking into the mic in his sleeve, and it's like, no, that's not how it works. It's supposed to be a little bit different. It's supposed to be a lot more subtle and nuanced, that you never notice that they're actually talking to somebody.
Exactly. And so they're doing a thing that nobody would do in the real world, but for screen purposes. And if you can come up with a better way, that's great. I learned somewhere, I don't know for a fact that this is true, but it makes perfect sense to me. Like, how many times have we seen any kind of a show where someone has a gun, cop, someone experienced, and they're going into the house, they don't know what's in there, and they're like this.
Yeah. And for those listening, Barry's showing how, they're pointing the barrel straight up, holding it close to their face, because then you get a tight shot. The camera can zoom in, and hey, he's armed. Yes.
Exactly. And back in the day when television, the format of a television was, I forget what it's called, but it was more of a, something like that. It was more a square than a rectangle. And it was a small screen too. So you're doing a lot more close-up shots of the actor's face. How do we get the gun and the face and the screen at the same time? Easy. Put the gun right up next to the face. But anybody who knows anything about firearms tactics, they laugh at that kind of thing. Likewise, how many times, I mean, this actually makes me crazy. I'm no firearms expert, but every time before the cops or the bad guys, whatever, they go into the house, the gun makes a clicking sound, or they rack the shotgun, which up until that moment had been a club. I was like, that's an intimidating club you're carrying there. Nobody does that. It's a little bit like slashing instead of stabbing. It's like, I mean, you're going into a scary looking house, your gun, like there's not a round in the chamber, and the gun is up pointing toward the sky next to your head. What? But there are reasons for doing those things, but they're TV reasons. They're not reality reasons. Similarly, I think with knife fighting, this is something I've gone over with my girls, Laura and Emma, any number of times. Like, if you ever are faced with a situation and you're holding a knife, what do you not do? It's boring at this point. They're like, please, God, not again. I'm like, just tell me, let's get past this. They're like, you don't hold out your arm like you're fencing or whatever. So your elbows straight, your shoulders extended. It's like that Jim Carrey thing where it's like, you didn't attack me the right way. It's all wrong, but they do it for dramatic reasons. And I guess if I had one complaint, and it's a very subjective complaint, about unrealistic ways that violence gets portrayed in movies and television, it's not Crouching Tiger. They're not pretending it's real. It's a beautiful and beautifully executed fantasy. It's when they're doing it as though it's supposed to be real life, and people can learn the wrong lessons that can, at least in theory, cause problems for them if they ever try to do something because they've seen it again and again on television or in the movies. That bothers me a little bit.
And let's switch to good examples now. the one that I come up with is one of my all-time favorite movies, Heat. Al Pacino, Robert De Niro for the first time on screen together. I mean, we could talk for hours about how great that movie is and why. But there's one scene in particular, and that's basically the execution of Waingro, the guy that they kicked out of the team. The execution went wrong. They were supposed to kill him beforehand, but that didn't happen. At a critical moment in the movie, Neil, Robert De Niro's character, decides that, nope, I don't want to leave this unfinished business. I'm going to get that guy. He should have run, and that's the whole thing about being able to just pack up and leave in 20 seconds if you need to. And it's a layered scene. So it starts with him flipping the alarm in the hotel. Waingro doesn't budge, and Neil pretends to be a security agent or something along those lines, and he is spotted on the camera as he's at that room. So you've got if I'm not mistaken, a police officer who's just comes up behind him and points a gun at him like freeze. And he does this really nifty move that is pretty ballsy. But the way it is executed is actually quite well. He's holding a flashlight and he steps backwards towards the officer until he actually feels the gun against his back. He hasn't turned his head. He doesn't know, and this is one of those fantasies also, is that somebody is pointing a weapon at you behind you, and you perfectly know where it is. No, you don't. You don't know. So this is a really ballsy move that you go backwards very slowly, showing your hands, pretending that okay. The cop doesn't realize, okay, this is a trap. And as soon as the gun contacts Neil's back, he turns around and basically disarms, clubs the guy, and it's over. So in that sense, for me, again, I'm not saying like this is the best move ever. I'm only saying that within the whole context of Neil is a professional, it's not something that he is improvising. Yeah. It's clearly been thought out. It's clearly been trained. And that's what I liked. And then the same thing when he basically kicks in the door, he turns his back to the little, small spy glass that is in the door, so that Waingro can't see him as he looks like he's directly.
Right. He's telling people like, "Come on, the fire alarms." Yeah.
So everything Waingro sees is consistent with like, and this is actually somebody from security. Yeah. He opens the door, Neil turns around, kicks it in, grabs him, throws him, and basically like, look at me. I want you to know
exactly look at me, because it's personal, but he doesn't dialogue and so make a big speech. He just look at me. This is personal. Boom, and he's done.
Yeah. So the main thing that I think we might really criticize that, but then again, the whole movie hinges on that point is that would he actually not escape? Would he actually do that? Go kill the guy, and as opposed to just take off and live out his life? We could argue about that, but when you're portraying a professional criminal like that, who's like top level, well trained, and at one point he says to the Al Pacino characters, like, you don't see me robbing a 7-Eleven or anything, but a tattoo Born to Lose.
You see me doing thrill stick-ups of 7-Elevens with a Born to Lose tattoo across my chest,
right?
I do not.
So we haven't watched that movie like 50,000 times at all, for sure. And the thing is that you can say that as dialogue, but that character consistently needs to show that in pretty much everything he does, which for the most part I think happens throughout the movie, except this one time when it really matters. When he should have been
when he's driving away with the girl, and John Voight calls him. Exactly. So this we could argue about. I mean, I don't know. The whole point, and he says it, he's trying. Yeah. But he himself had to kill Danny Trejo, his friend. Like, understand? Like, he actually forgives him before he kills him. He says, "I'll get a medic," even though Danny Trejo betrayed him, but he didn't really betray him. He just, they tortured Danny Trejo, and they tortured his wife in front of him. Like, Danny Trejo didn't really have a choice. So he's going to leave. And he's like, "No, bro, don't leave me here." And so Neil executes him. He's really got it in for Waingro, but he really wants to get away too, which, by the way, and then I want to come back to Heat, but just another principle for anybody who's listening. These are really important principles of writing. This one I learned from a guy named Robert McKee, who I think is terrific. He mostly lectures on screenwriting, screen, meaning television writing and feature film writing, but also everything he says is applicable to novel writing, any form of storytelling. In fact, his first book is just called Story, and then I forget the subtitle. Anyway, what McKee says is like, one of the things you want to do in a story is set up two internal contradictory motivations for a character, and then have the plot ruthlessly push those internal contradictions to a point where the character has to decide under pressure what to do. And that is the big moment that reveals character. I've never seen this done better in my life. I always got some friends who make fun of me for this because I get excited when I talk about the movie, which I'm not going to go into it in that level of detail right now. Aliens, the sequel to the Alien movie. This was written and directed by James Cameron. James Cameron is primarily known, I think it's safe to say, as a fantastic director. And what a lot of people don't appreciate is this guy is at least as good a writer as he is a director. And if you look at the dramatic structure of Aliens, from the beginning, there are two different versions, like the director's cut, a longer cut, it doesn't matter. The dramatic structure is this: what are Sigourney Weaver, Ripley's greatest drives, her character drives? What are her biggest motivations? One is she is terrified of these aliens that killed her entire crew on Nostromo in the first movie. She would do anything to avoid any kind of engagement with these aliens. She is like super post-traumatic stress disorder about the aliens. But then she meets a little girl, Newt, on the planet. And for whatever reason, depends on which version you see, she has an overwhelming need to be this girl's mother and protect her. And it's like, if you know this kind of structure and you know how good James Cameron is, you're going to be like, oh God, this sadist is going to make her choose. And he does. If you watch the way it goes, all the way, he sets it up to where the aliens come out. And with James Cameron, there's always like three endings. You know, you can never feel safe until like Newt is the aliens pulling the grates off, is going to get to the little girl, and Ripley's disappeared. And you're like, did she run away? Did she give into her greatest fear, which is the aliens? Was that her choice rather than protecting Newt? But then off camera, you hear zzz, 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 and she comes out in that exoskeleton suit and goes, "Get away from her, you bitch!" And you're like, wow, incredibly dramatic moment. Why? Because you didn't know she had these two like irresistible force, immovable object, internal drives. And at some point, Cameron gave her he didn't give her a choice. He made her choose. She chose what she chose. Now we know what Ripley's all about, which is facing down her fears, doing anything to protect this child. She's a mother. Oh my God. Love that movie. Heat has got something similar. I wouldn't say it's as much as I love Heat, I wouldn't say it's as dramatically, obvious is the wrong word because obvious makes it sound bad. It's just not as clear in the analysis. But what Neil's about, actually, it is pretty clear. He's looking for a way out. He's got one more score he wants. This comes up in his conversation in the diner with Al Pacino when they're talking about a regular life and getting away. And Al Pacino's like, "Are you there yet?" "No, not yet, but you know, I'm working on it." And it's the one last score thing. And so we know, like, he really wants out. He says, "I got a woman." He likes her. He cares about her. He says, "You don't have to work. You know, I got money. We'll get away." But so he really wants that. But he's got this thing where he does not like being crossed. He doesn't like leaving loose ends. And they tried to kill Waingro earlier. By the way, it's worth just mentioning another thing about that scene. So you talk about consistency with the character, how professional this guy is. What does it mean to be a professional in this context? It means you plan, you think ahead, you prepare. You don't friggin' kill Waingro in the parking lot of a diner and then like, what do we do with the body, guys? You know? This thing was set up. Even the meeting, even when he was like, you know, if you one more time kind of thing, to make Waingro think that he was just getting a warning. And they take him outside ostensibly to give him the money now that his guard is down, punch him in the stomach. Another guy, because they're a crew, they work in unison, open the trunk. What's in the trunk? It's lined with plastic, contractor bags, heavy plastic. It's like, wow, these guys don't leave anything to chance. But random shit happens. Cop car goes by. They got to wait for a second. And Waingro slips away. So, you know, Michael Mann did a nice job there of which is the bigger drive. And Neil in the end decides he just wants to have it both ways.
Yep.
And he blows it. So would he have made a different decision? I don't know. I got to mention, by the way, a novelist I'm friendly with, Meg Gardner, just wrote the prequel. It's like a prequel sequel to Heat 2 with Michael Mann. So they co-authored the books. Got a starred review and book list. I haven't read it yet. It's not out yet, but it's off to a great start, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, look that up. I'm taking notes.
Heat 2.
All right. Awesome.
They missed an opportunity to call it hotter.
I'm not going into that. I'm trying to keep
More
it.
heat.
Yes. Heat triple X.
But it sounds great. And that initial review was spectacular. So
cool.
I'm looking forward to it.
Before we go to the Patreon, because we've the bonus podcast episode in which I will be drinking, folks, because we've been going for about an hour now, and I know you've got some other stuff to do as well. Pet peeves as a writer, like when it comes to writing violence, when you read it or you see it on the screen, like, oh, come on, you could have done a better job of that. Is there anything that comes to mind?
It's funny. I don't know that I don't have specific pet peeves with regard to scenes of violence. Any of my friends, including you or family who knows me, is like, Wim, don't ask him about his pet peeves. You've only got, like, how much time do you have, man? Are you gonna do a 24-hour podcast? I have a lot of pet peeves. But I wouldn't say specifically for violence. Everything we've been talking about, I notice, both as just someone who's been reading stories and watching movies since I was small. So all of us, just by osmosis, pick up on some of the rules, the principles of good storytelling. And when they get violated, we tend to notice. We might not be able to diagnose what went wrong if we don't do this stuff ourselves for a living, but we'll sense that something went wrong and it'll bother us. We might misdiagnose this, but we won't be wrong in saying something was wrong there. And one of those things for sure is when, in the service of the plot, a character does something that the character wouldn't have done. I'm like, come on. Your job as the writer is to come. I understand you want the dramatic outcome. The plot has to proceed the way it's going to have to proceed, but you can't make up a thing just that's inconsistent to achieve that goal. It all has to be consistent. Look, any story you love, any novel, movie, television show, what you'll see is all the different elements, the character, obviously the place, the characters, the plot, but even like within the characters, those internal drives and everything, they are knit together so tightly. And when that's done well, everything reinforces everything else, and it's really satisfying. Best example right off the top of my head that I can think of, maybe The Godfather, where everything is knit together. And I'll say one more thing about it, because that's just the way I roll. Sorry. It's another thing. Everyone who knows me never believes it when I'm like, oh, one more thing. So, if anybody who's trying to learn structure, I would recommend a terrific book. It's called Into the Woods by a guy named John Yorke. And he analyzes television and movies and novels based on 5-act structure. It doesn't really matter whether you think structure's 3 or 5 or so. I don't care. It's a tool. But his analysis of The Godfather is so fascinating. I've never seen a better example of absolutely classic 5-act structure than in The Godfather. And it's, you can call it a devolution plot, because Michael starts at the beginning, he's a civilian, he wants nothing to do with his criminal family, and by the end he has ascended or descended depending on how you want to look at it, to he now is the Godfather. And there's that incredible scene. The book had a fantastic ending. Sorry, I'm one other point. Is this a great illustration? When I said you got to repurpose things, like the way you created that effect in the novel, you may have to do something different in the movie to create the same effect. Read the book and see how Mario Puzo closed it. It's chilling, amazing. Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo, when they wrote the screenplay, they're like, it won't work the same way. It's not, because now we're dealing with visual stuff. And the end of the movie is different. It's when Michael uses all his powers to persuade Kay that he was telling her the truth, that his sister Connie was lying about him killing all these men, that he's just a businessman. And Kay's like, oh, thank God. Oh my God, even just thinking about that scene gives me chills. And so Michael comforts her and he hugs her and he says, okay, we're good. And she walks out to get them a drink. And through the door, and now we're Kay looking through that door, his men come in, Albert Neri, Clemenza. And she turns and she sees them. Neri kisses his ring. Clemenza kisses his ring and says, Godfather. And Albert Neri comes to the door, looks at her, and closes the door. And her face is like, and then go to black, the door's closed, and we're done. And Michael Corleone's completes his dramatic trajectory from civilian to absolute Godfather, lying to his wife, doing whatever it takes but his final act is he is absolutely the Godfather. Now his ring is being kissed. Genius way to make a small change from the book. I don't even know how I got in the Godfather. I was talking about structure. There's just something to keep in mind. And if you're looking for structure, I personally learned a ton from this book, and it's helped me a lot in my screenwriting efforts.
I think that's one of the things that for the viewer or the reader is sometimes maybe not as clear, is that a lot of writing is very technical. A lot of action movies, action scene filming is very, very technical. And I'll put a link to the show notes when I interviewed Mark Dacascos about it. And he said basically the same thing, is that, the fight scenes, I approach them like, what is best for the character, what is best for the scene. That's the whole purpose. That is how, he wants to portray the character fighting. Good actors can obviously pull that off. Bad actors and bad fight scenes, then you can't get it. But the best example of just that the drama and the emotional content, I think, is the Bruce Lee Chuck Norris fight, in a Colosseum. It is that, this whole duel, there's a build-up, there's stretching, warming up first, and this, that. And at first, Bruce is getting his ass kicked. And then eventually, he kind of like, okay, I'm switching it up, I'm doing it differently. And then eventually he wins. But there's plenty of time showing the visual expressions, the frustration, the anger. And then the first time Chuck Norris's character actually is like, damn, I thought I was beating this guy up, but it's not working anymore. And eventually he takes his knee out. So it's not a realistic fight scene at all. However, it is excellently done. And if you were to write that scene, it would be very different in a book. It would be very, very different just to write all that in there. What we get to see in a couple of minutes visually is very, very different. And I think that's something that I want the people listening or watching this episode just to understand, is that it's sometimes very, very difficult to show reality as it is, because it needs to fit in with so many other parts of whatever you're trying to do with the story.
And I would even go further and say, your goal isn't to portray reality. It might be to portray realism, but realism and reality, not the same thing. We deal with reality. We don't need art to experience reality. That's what we deal with in the absence of art. Art is supposed to do something else, and it may have to do with realism. But I think it would be a mistake to think like, oh my God, I have to portray this as reality. Really, your top level goal in storytelling is make the reader or the viewer feel like she's there. That's it. You got to feel like you're there. If that doesn't happen, then what is the point? You're bored. You're not in the story. That's it. And then the second order question is, how do you do that? And there are, I don't know, countless ways that you might do that. Like you just said, it wasn't Enter the Dragon. What was the Chuck Norris Game of Death? I don't even remember. So all these movies.
I'm blanking on the name.
It doesn't matter. Tragically, there were only a few, but whatever it was, it wasn't realistic, but it wasn't supposed to be. But did the writer, director, the cinematographer, the whole team, did they make you feel like you were there? Yes. And if you're trying to write violence for the screen, then that would be a good exemplar. Say, what about this was making me feel I was there? By the way, one more little bit of advice, because all these things are so connected. Look, this is the best advice I've ever been given. And this was by Robert McKee. Luckily, I was already doing this, but I became more conscious of it. Best advice I've ever been given as a writer from a guy who I think is as thoughtful and insightful a lecturer, teacher on the topic of storytelling as I've ever come across. It's this: if you want to get better at writing, pick exemplars of the things that move you, that you think are great, or examples of what you're trying to do. If you want to write like heist movies and you think Heat is the bomb, which it is, then then analyze Heat. Let's just for a second, go deep on Heat for 1 second. Everybody knows that the scene, it's a midpoint scene. And that's for a reason structurally, but forget about that for the moment. It's the face-to-face meeting. Pacino and De Niro in the diner, which I can almost do from memory because I've watched it so many times. But I don't just watch it for entertainment, even though it's entertaining every time I watch it. I watch it for, why is this scene so amazing? What is going on here? And there are a lot of things you can analyze. For me, primarily, it's the dialogue. What is making this dialogue work so damn well? But there are other things too, like why is the acting so great? I don't know that much about acting, but I can tell you some things I think that are amazing about the acting in the scene. What are the camera angles that Michael Mann is using? How is it lit? What's going on in the background in juxtaposition to what's going on between the two principals? I don't know, a dozen things that make that scene great. But what I focus mostly on as a writer is, why is the dialogue so fantastic? So that's a thing you can do. Or if you're like, I want my descriptions, I'm a novelist and I want my settings to pop more, I want to make the reader feel in the scene, then go to the books that you think have the best settings, the most compelling. Oh my God, I felt like I was there in that field of flowers or in that melee on the ship deck or whatever it is you're writing, and read them again and again until you're a little bit inured to the magic of the scene and you can start to look for the magic act. That's the discipline, to quote Neil Macaulay. That's the discipline. You want to do that. There is no better way to get better. I mean, you have to write, you got to practice. And the theory, which is the how-to books, the Robert McKee, the story, all these things, John Yorke's book Structure, the theory is super useful, but the bridge, in a way, it's like the drills, which we have in martial arts. If you're trying to learn a musical instrument or learn a language, everything has drills. The drills of writing to me are, okay, I got the theory, I read the book, I practice on my own all the time, free sparring, whatever you want to call it. But the drills are, now I'm going to go read those books or watch those movies scene by scene and ask, why is this working so well? And by the way, you can do it with bad versions too. That's also a really interesting, so where you really want to get, when you watch a scene or read a scene or whatever it is, and you're like, this sucks. Good. You have an opinion. That's great. Why did it suck? What made it suck? And how would you make it better? When you keep doing that, I'm very lucky to live with my wife, Laura, who's an amazing literary agent, writer herself, and collaborator. And we talk about this stuff constantly. Thank God she finds it at least as interesting as I do. Otherwise, I'd become the most boring, person in the house you can imagine. But this is how you get good. Analyze the craft. There's no art without craft. A lot of people say that. Well, you can't teach art. Here, you want to hear a pet peeve? We're talking about pet peeves. When people friggin' say, well, you can't teach art, I'm like, nobody said you can teach art. Of course you can't teach art. Why are you even saying that? It's stupid. It's like saying you can't fly to the moon. Great. What do I do with that? Nobody said you could. You can't teach art. You shouldn't even try, but you can and must teach craft, or rather, you must learn craft. Craft can be learned, and something that can be learned can be taught. I know this because I've learned craft. I've been taught craft. I know this. And you can't be an artist without craft. If you're a phenomenon like Beethoven or whoever, then maybe you don't need lessons. It's just inside you. But on the assumption that you're not the Beethoven of writing, then you're going to have to learn some craft. And the way to do that is along the lines I'm saying. The other thing is, another pet peeve related to this one. People say rules are made to be broken. I like it. It's funny, but it's not true. Not when it comes to art. Rules aren't made to be broken. They're made to be bent to your will. But you don't know how to. Anyone can break a rule. A monkey can break a rule. It's the easiest thing in the world. Bending a rule to your purposes takes a lot of skill, and you have to have a deep knowledge. And I don't know if I'd say mastery. It's like, that's too comprehensive, but you have to be really adept with craft. And once you reach that point, then you can start bending the rules in the service of your art. So it's true that you can't learn art, can't teach art. Thankfully, nobody should be trying to teach or learn art, but we should be teaching and learning craft. Those are my pet peeves, and they're not exactly what you were asking for. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's great. I think we're gonna wrap up the main episode before we
break out the whiskey.
Yeah. Before we get to the bonus episode on Patreon. So first, Barry has a book coming up. I was fortunate enough to read an early draft of it. It's awesome. How do you pronounce this? Amok or Amok? How do you say it?
Amok in English.
Amok.
A-M-O-K. Yeah.
All right. It's a dog story for the Rain fans. I've been on your annoying you for years to write a dog story. So you finally have. And I'm like, yes.
You're not the only person who's
I know.
asked.
We conspired against you, behind your back. You don't know, but we all talk to each other. It's like, hey, no, it's your turn. Tell them. But I think it comes out in December, if I'm not mistaken.
December 6th. It's already available for pre-order on Amazon. And I'm really, really happy with the way this book came out. Thank you, Wim, for making it even better, as I don't want to say always, but at least for the last 15 years, which would be like the last, 13 books or something like that. Thanks for being one of my awesome beta readers. I can't embarrass myself too much in front of you, but it's better if I embarrass myself in front of you than in front of however many people are going to read it after it's published. Yes, it's a Docs prequel. So for anyone who is a Docs fan, and he does seem to have, I feel like just based on reader feedback, Docs is my most beloved character, which made writing a Docs origin story, which it's set in 1991, when he's only 4 years out of the Marines. He spent some time in Afghanistan with the CIA's Operation Cyclone, fighting alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. It's how did Docs become Docs? Everything you know about him. And this, I don't want to go back into it, but just very quickly, it relates to everything we've been talking about. Like, I've got a guy in current days, he's, I don't know, in his 50s or whatever now. And we've gotten to know him. And then there's a question of where did he come from? What were his formative experiences? All the things that we know about him, the essential elements of his character, came from somewhere. Obviously some genetic stuff, but that's not much I can do with that in the story. But then, like, how did the environment act on it? What made him who and what he is? And it was a little, and so all these things have to be consistent. I can't just tell, it's not enough to tell a great story if it's an origin story. You have to finish that origin story. And this is the feeling I want you to have. Of course, this is what happened to him around 1991. Like, nothing else could possibly explain this. Of course. That's what I was going for. It was a little intimidating because people are invested in this character, exceptionally, I think, invested in this character. It took me longer than it should have for a variety of reasons. But none of that matters now, in the sense, at least compared to, if I may say so, it is an awesome book. I'm so happy with it. Everybody who reads it cries, which goes back to, what's the goal when you're writing a story? You got to make people feel like they're there. They're these characters. They feel the characters' feelings. And when people cry when I read a story I wrote, I feel a little sadistic, but also like great success. So anyway, it came out really well. Thanks for asking and for the plug. But anyone who loves Docs, I think you're really going to enjoy this book. Or even if you don't love Docs, it's a pretty good story.
I'll put a link in the show notes to a direct link to the book so that people can pre-order. I did, so you should too if you're listening to this. Also put a link to your website, Barry, so that everybody can find you. And obviously there's a tremendous amount of more books that they can and should read. Before we go to the Patreon bonus episode, any parting words?
No, other than this was super fun, and it's so easy to talk to you, which is why we wind up wasting time, complaining about the state of the world and how much better it would be if we were philosopher kings. All the time. Total pleasure. We've been talking about this for a long time. I'm so glad you proposed it, because I knew it would be a really fun, interesting conversation, a great way to tease out more general principles of writing, and also for me to learn more from you about violence generally, which I already have learned a lot. So thank you for that.
It was a pleasure of mine as well, obviously, as always. Folks, we are going to continue talking for the bonus episode. That my patrons have some choice questions for Barry, and I will start getting into the whiskey as well. I'll put a link in the show notes to the episode as well. In the meantime, obviously, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. You can join me on Patreon. It's the 5th year, and I'm closing in, I think, on 800 posts already, about 300 videos. So it's like a lot, and you get immediate access to everything if you join. So I would
like
recommend
the Matrix. When you join,
right?
just
you can download it. And all right, folks, everybody, thank you again for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
Thank you, everyone. This was fun.